Could we move on now just to speak a little bit about the new clinic of hysteria? And in the aims of analysis, you make reference to Eric Laurent's thinking on hysteria. And you note how in the new clinic of hysteria, and I quote you here, it's not so much the effect of the signifier on the body, but the symptom, taking on the symptom of another body. And that's the end of the quote. So this idea that it's the taking on of a symptom of another body. Could you elaborate a little bit more about what that means and how it presents in the new clinic of hysteria?
Certainly. I think Freud himself gives an example of this. I believe, and this was, you made reference to this in the written version of the question that I got prior to this interview, but I think it's in the interpretation of dreams, where Freud is talking about a hospital ward and the observation that a patient there may take on the cough as a type of symptom of another patient. I think the example was a patient observes that another patient is getting a lot of attention from the doctor from a physical symptom. I think it was a cough. And so this patient takes on a cough as well as a symptom. Mm-hmm. Taking on another person's symptom is a symptom. The sort of classical Lacanian formulation of hysteria has to do with the effect of the signifier on the body, causing, in very classical psychoanalytic terms, conversion symptomatology, right? The words can have a traumatic effect on the body, leading to the development of sort of bodily symptoms, which in the neurologic realm are referred to as conversion symptoms, that are a function of signification, and that with the interpretation of the symptom tend to go away. So in a hysterical conversion symptom, I mean, that's sort of how it tends to develop. And if the symptom, in at least a classical sense, is interpreted properly, the unconscious material is brought to the surface, is no longer repressed, and there's no impetus for the symptom formation, and thus the symptom disappears. So, I think what this new clinic of hysteria that has developed, and Eric Laurent discussed this in the context of a meeting of a French group, Euphorca, that was held in Montpellier in 2011, where these formulations were developed about how to rethink not only hysteria, but obsessional neurosis from the perspective of the late Lacan. And the notion was that in hysteria, we call the subject with hysteria, symptom takes on the symptom of another being. And the example I gave in the book was from a case presented some years ago at a Congress by Luc van der Vennet, where the patient who was in analysis, this analysand, had a set of symptoms, and you can read the details. It's a very, very interesting case. Had a set of symptoms related to a number of different phenomena, and that in the course of analysis were linked to a kind of traumatic event that occurred for this subject, where what seems pretty clear to me, the symptoms were the symptoms of her brother, and what the brother was dealing with at this moment, that she, due to some importance given to this specific event in this subject's life, that this subject takes on as her own symptoms. So, what's interesting about it, and I brought this up, and I make a passing comment about this in the book, is, there's a certain kind of jouissance value that develops in this symptom of the analysand that she adopted from her brother, that she took on from her brother. And it does, for me, it raises the interesting question of whose jouissance is at stake, and the extent to which we tend to always think about jouissance as linked to a subject. But in this case, if the symptom is another symptom, what is the status of jouissance in this kind of situation? I think it's an interesting question, but it speaks to the fact that I think in the development of sort of the hysteric structure today in our contemporary setting, it may be more often something we can understand as the subject adopting a symptom of another, as opposed to a direct effect of the signifier on the subject's body. And this is probably a function of some change, I would say, in the functioning of the symbolic order today. And the fact that it doesn't have the same effect maybe that it did in Freud's time.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, the one concept that came to mind when you were talking was the notion of hysterical identification, whereby one takes on a symptom of someone, not because, and this is just a basic point, but useful, I teach a lot of Lacanian theory at an introductory level. And, in everyday discourses and discussions and the vernacular of identification, that tends to mean I like something about this person or I gravitate towards them. But the great point in Freudian and, of course, Lacanian theory is an identification can occur, particularly when we're talking about a hysterical identification with a symptom that someone else is suffering, that one takes on as one's own. It's not about necessarily liking them or gravitating to them in any way. It's often, at least in Freud's idea of hysterical identifications, the taking on of a symptom which puts me in the similar location to the person who has that. Anyways, that's just a little, a slight tangent, but...
And let me just make a quick comment about that. I agree. And I think you're right to point that out. And I think it speaks to the fact that in the earlier Lacan, we tend to think of the symbolic as dominant and kind of structuring everything. And here we're talking about something where there's almost a different kind of relationship between the imaginary, thinking of identification, the imaginary and the real, that's no longer sort of mediated through the symbolic. And I think this is present in various social phenomena as well. So, I mean, I think this speaks to a shift in the ability of the symbolic to be kind of the dominant register and a kind of different relationship, let's say, that can exist between the imaginary and the real that's not mediated through the symbolic. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I also wanted to just, as it were, italicize or reiterate the point that you'd made about whose jouissance. We don't have to elaborate much more here, but it's just, I think, a point of theory and indeed of clinical practice and consideration that I think is important to bear in mind, not necessarily to answer it, but just because, as you say, the presumption is almost automatically the jouissance is of the subject who seems to be speaking it or experiencing it. And it's just crucial, I think, to bear in mind that it's not necessarily quite so straightforward. Funnily enough, in our conversation, I seem to be pulling out all these, early kind of more Freudian references where you're talking often with a focus on more later Lacan. But it reminds me of this great footnote right towards the end of Interpretation of Dreams, when Freud has to consider the question of, well, whose wish? Right. So, we spend the whole time talking about the fulfillment of a wish or the disguised representation of a repressed wish. And then has this footnote where he's forced to consider the question, well, whose wish? Because it's not necessarily so obviously that it's the dreamer's own wish. Anyways, that's another tangent. But I think a nice reminder in terms of Lacanian psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis too, that the question of whose or who seems to be the experiencing subject is more complicated than at first glance it may appear.